The calm before the fall, the empire still breathes. Long before the world collapses, it usually looks normal. People still wake up. Markets still open. Soldiers still stand at gates. Kings still sit on thrones. And the empire still believes it will last forever. But in history, the end of an empire rarely begins with one giant explosion. It begins with small things. A small tax. A small war. A small shortage of grain. A small rumor. And slowly, like a candle losing its strength, the empire starts to dim. The empire at its peak, but it's already weak. Most empires reach a point where they look powerful. They have huge armies, tall stone cities, great roads, big temples, gold coins, laws, writing, governors, kings, palaces. And when people look at it, they think, this will never fall. But the truth is, peak power is often the beginning of decline. Because at the peak, the empire becomes too large, too expensive, too slow, and it begins to carry its own weight like a tired giant. Money becomes a lie. In many dying empires, one of the first signs is money trouble asterisk. The empire needs to pay. Soldiers, builders, officials, tax collectors, priests, ship crews. But wars cost too much. So rulers begin doing something very quiet and very deadly. They start weakening the currency. Instead of pure gold, they mix the coins with cheap metal. The coin still looks the same, but it is not. And soon people notice. Then prices rise. Bread costs more. Oil costs more. Salt costs more. And the poor suffer first. Always. Food starts disappearing. Empires need food. They need wheat, barley, rice, olives, fish, meat. But as the empire grows, it becomes dependent on long supply chains. A city that once grew its own food becomes lazy. It depends on ships. It depends on distant farms. And when one region fails, the whole system shakes. Then comes drought, crop failure, floods, locusts, war in farming areas. And suddenly, the empire is hungry. Hungry empires become violent. The army gets tired. Armies are like machines. They require constant fuel. Fuel means pay, food, training, weapons, discipline. But late empires often do this. They stop paying soldiers on time. Then soldiers begin stealing from villages, taking bribes, deserting, joining bandits. And some soldiers stop being loyal to the empire and start being loyal only to their commander. That is the beginning of civil war. The provinces stop caring. The empire has distant provinces, far lands, far people, different languages, different cultures. In the beginning, the provinces fear the empire. But later, the empire becomes weak. And the provinces start asking, why are we paying taxes to these people? And slowly, governors become independent. They still claim loyalty. But they act like kings. Rumors become stronger than truth. In stable times, people trust the government. In dying times, people trust rumors. Rumors spread like smoke. The emperor is sick. The capital is bankrupt. The gods are angry. Barbarians are coming. The army is losing. And fear grows. Fear makes people selfish. Selfishness breaks societies. A strange quiet falls over the capital. The capital still looks great. But the spirit changes. The streets feel different. More guards. Less laughter. More empty shops. People stop celebrating. They stop believing in the future. And that is one of the biggest signs of collapse. Not war, not plague, but loss of hope. The empire still stands, but it is already sick, like a great tree with rot inside. Still tall, still green, but slowly dying. The slow breaking, plague, war, and internal rot. Now the cracks widen, and history begins to move faster. The plague arrives quietly. In many empires, collapse is accelerated by disease. Plague arrives like this. A ship enters port. A merchant coughs. A soldier collapses. A family dies. At first, people think it's normal sickness. But soon, the streets fill with funerals. And then, there are no funerals. Because there are too many dead. Cities become traps. Cities are normally safe. But during collapse, cities become dangerous. Because cities are crowded. And when food runs low, people fight. And when plague spreads, people panic. And when panic rises, the government becomes harsh. Then the city becomes a cage. The government responds the wrong way. Late empires often respond badly. They raise taxes, punish citizens, blame minorities, execute critics, silence truth. Instead of fixing the problem, they try to control fear. But fear cannot be controlled. Civil wars begin. Now comes the classic empire-ending poison. Internal war. Generals fight generals. Brothers fight brothers. One emperor becomes two. Then three. Then five. Each claiming the throne. Each draining the treasury. Each killing soldiers who should be fighting outside enemies. And the empire bleeds itself. The borders collapse. The borders were once strong. But now the army is busy with civil war. So border forts fall. Tribes invade. Raiders cross. Villages burn. The empire tries to respond. But it is too slow. People leave the cities. Now people begin fleeing. They abandon markets, theaters, temples, schools. They go to hills, farms, forests, remote villages. The city becomes hollow. Like a shell. The empire still exists. But it is now split. Hungry, diseased, and confused. And the world begins to feel old. Last century, the world turns to dust. Now the empire enters its final stage. The army becomes foreign. The empire cannot recruit enough soldiers. So it hires outsiders. Mercenaries. Foreign warriors. Tribes once called enemies. Now they wear the empire's armor. And they defend the empire. For money. Not loyalty. The strongmen rise. The people stop trusting emperors. So they trust local leaders. Warlords. Powerful generals. Local kings. They offer protection. But in exchange, they take freedom. The old institutions become empty. The empire still has Senate, laws, courts, councils, but they become theater. They still meet. They still speak. But no one listens. Real power belongs to soldiers and money. Farms become fortresses. Farmers stop selling crops. They build walls. They keep food for themselves. They hide grain. Knowledge starts fading. When collapse deepens, schools close. Libraries burn. Teachers disappear. Books rot. Not because people hate learning, but because survival becomes everything. And when survival becomes everything, culture dies quietly. The empire stops being one. Now the empire is an illusion. On paper, it exists. But in reality, each region is separate. Each city is alone. Each village is its own world. The empire is still called an empire, but it is already gone. Only the name remains. The last whisper, the empire dies, and the new world begins. Now comes the final moment. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet. The last ruler is not great. In many collapses, the final ruler is not legendary. He is not heroic. He is not evil. He is simply weak, tired, trapped, a man in a broken system. The capital becomes a ghost. The capital still has buildings, but many are abandoned. Fountains stop running. Streets crack. Temples are empty. The palace is guarded, but not respected. The final invasion. Then one day, a foreign army arrives, or a rival king, or a coalition of tribes. Not necessarily huge, not necessarily unstoppable. But the empire cannot resist, because the empire has already collapsed inside. So the gates open, the defenders surrender, and the city falls. The world does not end, it changes. And this is the most important part. When an empire dies, the world does not end. People still wake up. Children are still born. Rain still falls. Bread is still baked. But life becomes smaller. Local. Hard. Slow. The new age begins. After collapse, people live in small kingdoms, tribal territories, villages, fort towns. Trade becomes rare. Travel becomes dangerous. Coins disappear. Barter returns. Writing becomes uncommon. And the world becomes quiet again. The echoes remain. Even after the empire is gone, its echoes remain. Broken roads, ruined aqueducts, empty arenas, shattered statues, abandoned forts. And sometimes, people walk past these ruins, and they cannot even remember who built them. And so the empire ends. Not with thunder, not with fire, but with a whisper, a last breath, a fading candle, a quiet world, drifting. And we're starting at the beginning. Not the beginning of the empire, but the beginning of the end. Because most empires don't fall in one day. They don't collapse like a building exploding. They fade, like a candle that has been burning for too long. So let's begin. A world that still looks normal. Imagine an empire. Still standing. Still functioning. Still collecting taxes. Still building roads. Still training soldiers. Still hosting festivals. Still carving statues. Still writing laws. And if you were a person living in that empire, you might believe that this system would last forever. Because that's what empires always feel like. When you live inside them, they feel permanent. They feel like nature. Like the sun rising. Like the seasons turning. Like the ocean. But history has a strange pattern. When something looks the strongest, it is often already beginning to weaken. And the weakening does not start with fire. It starts with small changes, small shortages, small corruption, small fear. And those small things build up, slowly, quietly, until one day, everything breaks. The empire grows too large. Empires expand. They take land. They build walls. They conquer cities. They absorb kingdoms. They rename provinces. They send governors. They demand loyalty. And at first, expansion feels like success. It feels like strength. It feels like destiny. But there is a hidden cost. The bigger the empire becomes, the more expensive it becomes, the more complicated it becomes, the more fragile it becomes. An empire is like a machine. A machine needs maintenance. And the larger the machine, the more parts it has. The more parts, the more failures. Roads must be repaired. Forts must be supplied. Ships must be built. Armies must be paid. Officials must be bribed. Or they will betray you. And slowly, the empire becomes less like a proud conqueror and more like a tired giant, trying to carry its own weight. Money begins to lose meaning. One of the earliest signs of collapse is money, because money is trust. A coin is not just metal. A coin is a promise. A coin says, this empire is stable. This empire is powerful. This empire will still exist tomorrow. But as the empire begins to strain, the rulers begin to cheat. Quietly, not loudly, not openly. They do not announce it. They do not tell the people. They simply begin to change the coin. Gold becomes less gold. Silver becomes less silver. The coin looks the same, but it is. And at first, most people don't notice. A baker takes the coin. A farmer takes the coin. A soldier takes the coin. But then, someone notices the weight. Someone notices the sound. Someone notices the color. And suddenly, trust begins to crack. Prices rise. Bread becomes expensive. Oil becomes expensive. Salt becomes expensive. Cloth becomes expensive. And the poor feel it first. They always do. Because the rich have stores of food. The rich have land. The rich have power. But the poor have only the market. And when the market becomes unstable, the poor suffer. And when the poor suffer, the streets become restless. Food becomes uncertain. Now we move to the next quiet disaster. Food. Every empire needs food. And in the beginning, the empire usually grows its own food. Local farms. Local fields. Local villages. But later, the empire becomes dependent. It builds huge cities. Cities too large to feed themselves. So the empire creates supply lines. Grain ships. Caravans. Storehouses. Tax grain. Government distribution. And this works. Until it doesn't. Because supply lines are fragile. A drought can break them. A war can break them. A storm can break them. A rebellion can break them. And once the supply line breaks, the city becomes hungry. Hungry cities become angry cities. And angry cities become dangerous. The army becomes a problem. Empires rely on armies. But armies are expensive. Armies must be fed. Armies must be paid. Armies must be disciplined. And late empires often fail at this. The treasury is low. The officials are corrupt. The roads are unsafe. The provinces are unstable. So the soldiers begin to feel forgotten. They begin to feel cheated. And when soldiers feel cheated, they become unpredictable. Some begin stealing from villages. Some begin demanding bribes. Some begin selling their weapons. Some begin deserting. And some begin following their general instead of their emperor. This is how civil wars begin. Not because people love war, but because the system breaks and power shifts to the people who still have weapons. Provinces stop caring. Now we move far from the capital, out to the edges, the distant provinces, the border towns, the far farms, the mountains, the deserts, the coastlines. The empire still claims these lands. It still draws them on maps. It still demands taxes. But the people in those provinces start asking a simple question. What do we get in return? In the early days, the empire gives them roads, trade, security, stability. But in the late days, the empire gives them tax collectors, corruption, slow response, and empty promises. So loyalty fades. Not in one day, not in one rebellion, but slowly. A governor becomes more independent. A local leader becomes stronger. A city begins to act alone. And the empire becomes less unified, without anyone officially announcing it. The first true sign of collapse. And now, we reach the final minutes of part 1. The empire still stands. The emperor still rules. The Senate still meets. The taxes still flow. The army still marches. But something has changed. The people no longer believe. They still obey. But they don't believe. And that is one of the most dangerous moments in the life of an empire. Because once belief is gone, only force remains. And force is expensive. And so, part 1 ends here. The empire is still alive, but it is already sick. And in the next part, we will see the sickness spread. Slowly, quietly, inevitably. Welcome back. If you're listening tonight, you're continuing the slow journey through the quiet collapse of an empire. Not the kind of collapse you see in movies. Not loud. Not dramatic. Not one giant explosion. But a collapse that happens the way old stone breaks, one crack at a time. In part 1, we watched the empire begin to weaken. Money lost trust. Food became uncertain. The army grew tired. The provinces stopped caring. And the capital still looked strong, but felt different. Tonight, we enter part 2, the slow breaking. The moment when the cracks stop being small and begin to spread. So get comfortable. Let your eyes relax. Let your breathing slow. And let the history carry you into sleep. When the empire starts feeling old, there's a strange moment in history. When an empire starts to feel old, not ancient, not legendary, just tired. The streets still exist. The buildings still stand. The laws still exist. But the energy is gone. People stop dreaming about the future. They stop believing the empire will improve. They stop believing things will get better. And instead, they begin thinking only about survival. And when a society stops imagining a future, it begins living inside its own decline. The arrival of plague. Now, we move into one of the most common forces that speeds up collapse. Disease. Plague. Epidemics. It rarely begins with a dramatic moment. It usually begins quietly. A ship enters the harbor. A merchant arrives at the market. A traveler comes into town. A soldier returns from the border. Someone coughs. Someone sweats. Someone collapses. At first, the empire does what it always does. It ignores it. Because empires, especially late empires, have seen sickness before. They assume it will pass. They assume it is local. They assume it is manageable. But then, more people get sick. The sickness spreads through crowded streets, through public baths, through markets, through shared water, through temples, through armies, through homes. And suddenly, the empire realizes something terrifying. Cities become dangerous. In stable times, cities are the pride of empires. Cities represent order. Cities represent civilization. Cities represent wealth. But in collapse, cities become traps. Because cities depend on supply. They depend on food. They depend on clean water. They depend on law. They depend on public trust. And when the empire begins breaking, the city feels it first. If grain shipments fail, the city starves. If plague spreads, the city dies. If soldiers riot, the city burns. And so, people begin to fear the city. They stop traveling into it. They stop trading inside it. They stop trusting it. And the great shining capital begins to feel like a crowded cage. Hunger makes people different. There is something about hunger that changes the human mind. In good times, people are polite. They share. They smile. They talk. They trade. They laugh. But when food becomes uncertain, people chain. They begin hiding. They begin hoarding. They begin stealing. They begin lying. They begin fighting. The empire may still claim to be civilized, but hunger strips civilization away, like wind stripping leaves from a tree. Nah. The government responds, and the government almost always responds the wrong way. The government tightens its grip. Late empires do not like admitting weakness, so instead of fixing the causes, they tighten control. They raise taxes. They increase punishments. They expand the police. They create new laws. They demand loyalty oaths. They punish citizens for speaking badly. They punish merchants for raising prices. They punish farmers for hiding grain. But the government cannot punish hunger away, and it cannot punish plague away. So every punishment creates more resentment, and resentment is dangerous, because resentment turns into rebellion. Civil war does not always begin with an announcement. It does not always begin with a flag. It often begins as a rumor. The emperor is weak. The emperor is sick. The emperor is controlled by corrupt advisors. The general on the border is stronger. The army in the east is loyal to someone else. And then, a governor refuses orders. A general stops sending taxes. A province declares independence. At first, the empire pretends it's nothing. But then, armies move. Not to fight foreign enemies, but to fight each other. And this is one of the deadliest moments in the life of an empire. Because an empire can survive an invasion. An empire can survive a plague. An empire can survive famine. But when an empire fights itself, it destroys its own foundation. The borders become soft. While the empire is distracted, something happens. Something predictable. Something almost inevitable. The borders weaken. The border forts are underpaid. The border soldiers are sick. The border commanders are fighting in civil war. The border supply lines fail. And beyond the border, there are always people watching. Tribes, rivals, kings, raiders, nomads. They do not need to be evil. They do not need to be monsters. They only need to be opportunistic. And when they see the empire struggling, they move. Raids begin. Small at first. A village is attacked. A farm is burned. A caravan disappears. Then larger. A fort is taken. A town is looted. A road is cut. And the empire responds slowly. Because the empire is already breaking inside. The first true collapse And now, we reach the end of part. The empire was sick, but it still looked strong. The empire begins to break, not all at once, not everywhere, but in enough places that the people begin to understand. This is not a temporary crisis. This is not a bad year. This is not a single disaster. This is the beginning of a new reality. The markets feel unstable. The streets feel tense. The countryside feels unsafe. The borders feel open. The capital feels anxious. And people begin making a quiet decision. They stop thinking of themselves as citizens of the empire and start thinking of themselves as survivors. And as the night continues, as your breathing slows, as your eyes grow heavier, softly, quietly, like the last light of a dying lamp, because in part, we will enter the final century, the world of warlords, the world of fatting knowledge, the world where the empire is still named, but no longer real. You're doing great. Just keep breathing slowly and let the story carry you. In part 1, the empire began to weaken. In part 2, the empire began to break. And now, in part 3, we enter the last century. Not the last year, not the last day, but the last long stretch, where the empire still has a name, but no longer has a soul. This is the stage of collapse, where the world becomes smaller, where the future becomes unclear, where people stop trusting distant rulers and start trusting whoever is closest, whoever is strongest, whoever can protect them. So let's begin. Hourglass not done, minute 06. The empire still exists on paper. It's strain. But in the final century, the empire still exists. Officially, the emperor still has a title. The capital still has walls. The coins still have faces. The government still sends orders. And yet, the empire is no longer truly united. It is like an old ship, still floating, but full of leaks. The crew is fighting. The sails are torn. The wood is rotting. And the passengers are beginning to climb into lifeboats. Minute 6:14. The economy becomes a shadow. In a strong empire, money moves. Trade moves. Goods flow. But in a dying empire, trade slows. Merchants travel less. Caravans become rare. Ships avoid dangerous ports. And when trade slows, cities shrink. Markets grow empty. Craftsmen lose work. Then taxes fall. And the government becomes desperate. Late empires often respond by demanding more. More taxes. More grain. More soldiers. More loyalty. But the people have less. And when you demand more from people who have less, you create anger. You create rebellion. You create collapse. Derelict, minute 14:22. People start leaving the great cities. This is one of the quietest and saddest signs. People leave. Not because they hate the empire. Not because they want revolution. But because they want safety. Cities were once symbols of civilization. But now, cities are dangerous. Cities are where plague spreads. Cities are where riots happen. Cities are where soldiers fight. Cities are where hunger grows. Cities are where taxes are collected. So families begin to leave. They go to small villages. They go to hills. They go to farmland. They go to remote valleys. The great city still stands, but it becomes hollow, like a shell. Crossed, minute 22:30. The army becomes something else. In the early empire, the army was the empire. The army was loyal. The army was disciplined. The army was paid. But in the final century, the army changes. Because the empire cannot recruit enough citizens. Not anymore. The people are tired. The people are poor. The people are sick. So the empire hires outsiders. Mercenaries. Foreign warriors. Tribes once considered enemies. They are paid. If the empire can pay. They are fed. If the empire can feed. And slowly, the army becomes less like a national force and more like a marketplace. The highest bidder wins loyalty. The strongest commander gains followers. And once an empire's army becomes a marketplace, the empire is already doomed. Minute 3038. Strongmen replace institutions. Nah. We enter the world of strongmen. In stable times, people trust institutions. They trust courts. They trust laws. They trust councils. They trust the government. But when collapse deepens, institutions feel distant, slow, corrupt, weak. So people stop looking to the emperor. They stop looking to the Senate. They stop looking to distant officials. Instead, they look to the local commander, the local warlord, the local governor, the local landlord, the person with soldiers, the person with food, the person with walls. And this is how the empire breaks into pieces. Not officially, not instantly, but practically. Minute 3845. Farms become fortresses. The countryside changes. Farmers no longer trust roads. They no longer trust merchants. They no longer trust tax collectors. So they build walls. They hide grain. They keep animals close. They stop selling extra food. They begin living like people in a sea, even when there is no official siege. Because in the last century, the world feels unsafe everywhere. Bandits roam. Soldiers steal. Tax collectors demand. Raiders attack. So farms become fortresses. Villages become camps. And life becomes local. Books, minute 4552. Knowledge begins to fade. This is one of the most haunting parts of collapse. Not the battles. Not the fires. Not the invasions. But the quiet fading of knowledge. Schools close. Teachers leave. Libraries stop receiving new books. Writers stop being paid. Not because people hate learning, but because learning requires stability. And stability is gone. When a society becomes focused only on survival, culture becomes a luxury. And slowly, a world that once had scholars, engineers, architects, philosophers, poets, scientists, begins to lose them. Not all at once, but slowly, quietly, like ink fading from an old page. Fog, minute 5257. The empire becomes a name, not a reality. Nah. The empire still has a name. It still has official maps. It still has titles. It still has ceremonies. But in reality, the empire is no longer one system. It is many systems, many rulers, many loyalties, many borders, many small powers. And the capital becomes less like the center of the world and more like a symbol, a memory, a ghost. Candle, minute 5760. The last feeling before the end. And now, as part 3 comes to a close, We arrive at a strange emotional moment. The people sense something, even if they cannot explain it. They sense that the old world is ending. They still go to the market. They still bake bread. They still repair roofs. They still raise children. But they no longer expect the empire to save them. They no longer believe the old system will return. And when belief disappears, the final stage becomes inevitable. Because in Part 4, the empire does not just weaken, it dies. Not with fireworks, not with dramatic music, but with a whisper. A final quiet whisper of a world that once felt eternal. This is the final part, the last chapter, the last quiet stretch, before the empire becomes history. In Part 1, the empire began to weaken. In Part 2, it began to break. In Part 3, it entered its final century, still named, but no longer real. And now, in Part 4, we reach the end. Not a loud end, not a cinematic end, not an ending with bright explosions, but the kind of ending history usually gives. A slow fading, a soft collapse, a final whisper. So settle in. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders loosen. And let the story drift forward, one calm step at a time. #hourglass not done, minute 06. The empire becomes routine. At the very end, the empire feels like routine. Not glory, not pride, not destiny, just routine. Officials still stamp documents. Soldiers still stand at gates. Judges still hold court. Priests still perform rituals. Merchants still argue over prices. But it all feels empty, like an old theater, where the actors still perform, even though the audience has left. #crown, minute 6:14. The last ruler is not legendary. In many empires, the final ruler is not famous. He is not a genius. He is not a hero. He is not even always a villain. He is often just a person, a tired person, a trapped person, a person born into a system that is already collapsing. He inherits debt, rebellion, famine, plague, a broken army, disloyal governors, empty grain stores, and he is expected to fix it. But the truth is, no single ruler can fix an empire when the empire itself is no longer able to function. #classical, minute 14:22. The capital still stands, but it feels wrong. The capital is still there. The walls still rise. The palace still sits. The statues still cast shadows. But the feeling has changed. There are more guards, more checkpoints, more suspicion. Some buildings are abandoned. Some streets are quieter. Some markets are smaller. The city is not dead, but it feels like a person, recovering from a sickness that never truly ends. #minute 22:30. The currency finally breaks. Now we reach a point where the money can no longer pretend. Coins are mixed with cheap metals. Coins are clipped. Coins are shaved. Coins are forged. People stop trusting currency. And when people stop trusting currency, they stop trusting trade. And when trade slows, the empire becomes even weaker. Because empires depend on movement. Movement of goods. Movement of food. Movement of soldiers. Movement of information. And now, movement becomes dangerous. So movement becomes rare. The world grows smaller. Hash crossed, minute 30:38. The army chooses survival. At the end, the army is no longer loyal to the empire. Not because every soldier is evil. Not because every commander is cruel. But because the empire cannot provide. It cannot pay. It cannot feed. It cannot protect. So the army chooses survival. Some soldiers become bandits. Some soldiers become mercenaries. Some soldiers join local warlords. Some soldiers simply disappear. And the empire loses the one thing it always depended on, the force that made it real. Hash bow and arrow, minute 38:46. The final invasion arrives. And now, the final invasion comes. But here is the strange part. The final invasion is not always the strongest invasion. It is not always the biggest army. It is not always the most terrifying enemy. Often, it is simply the invasion that arrives when the empire has no strength left. The borders have been raided for years. The forts have been abandoned. The roads are broken. The governors are independent. The army is scattered. So when the invaders arrive, the empire cannot respond. Not because it does not want to, but because it cannot. And the people do not feel shocked. They feel resigned. Like they have been waiting for this moment. Hash Castle, minute 46:52. The gates open. The city prepares. The palace gathers guards. The officials argue. The priests pray. But there is no miracle. The walls are old. The defenders are hungry. The commanders are divided. The citizens are afraid. And then, the gates open. Sometimes with battle. Sometimes with negotiation. Sometimes with betrayal. Sometimes with surrender. But in the end, the result is the same. The empire's capital falls. And the empire's name becomes a memory. Hash, minute 52:57. The world does not end, it shrinks. And now we reach the most important truth. When an empire collapses, the world does not end. The sun still rises. Rain still falls. Children are still born. Old people still tell stories. Bread is still baked. Fires still warm homes. But life becomes smaller. The empire once connected thousands of miles. Now, a person may never travel beyond the next village. The empire once protected roads. Now, roads become dangerous. The empire once kept peace. Now, local warlords enforce their own rules. The empire once made trade possible. Now, trade becomes rare. The empire once made education common. Now, education becomes a privilege. The world becomes local, hard, quiet. Hash candle, minute 57:60. The last whisper. And now, we come to the final moments. The empire is gone. Not with thunder. Not with fireworks. Not with dramatic music. But with silence. A broken statue. A cracked road. A dry fountain. An abandoned arena. A palace with empty halls. And the people who live after walk among the ruins and do not fully understand what once existed. They know it was powerful. They know it was old. They know it was great. But it feels unreal, like a dream. And the empire becomes a whisper, an echo of a world that once believed it would last forever. And as your breathing slows, as the night grows quieter, as your mind drifts, we let this story end, the same way the empire ended. Softly, quietly, without struggle. Just a last whisper, fading into sleep. Welcome. Tonight, we're going to drift into history. Slow history. Quiet history. The kind of history you can fall asleep to. Pause 3 seconds. This story is called Echoes of the Apocalypse, Empire's Last Whisper. Pause 4 seconds. #00 3003 00 setting the mood. Most empires don't fall in one day. They don't collapse like a building. They fade. Like a candle that has been burning too long. Pause 4 seconds. #03 0012 00 The empire looks strong. Imagine an empire. Still collecting taxes. Still building roads. Still marching armies. Pause 3 seconds. And yet, inside, something is already weakening. Pause 5 seconds. #1200 2200 The empire grows too large. The larger an empire becomes, the more expensive it becomes. Pause 3 seconds. Roads must be repaired. Forts must be supplied. Governors must be controlled. Pause 4 seconds. And slowly, the empire becomes a tired giant. Pause 6 seconds. #22 0032 00 Money loses trust. Money is not just metal. Money is trust. Pause 4 seconds. But late empires weaken their coins. Gold becomes less gold. Silver becomes less silver. Pause 5 seconds. And prices rise. Bread rises. Oil rises. Pause 6 seconds. #32 0042 00 Food becomes uncertain. Supply lines are fragile. One drought. One war. One storm. Pause 4 seconds. And the city becomes hungry. Pause 6 seconds. #42 0052 00 The army gets tired. Soldiers stop being loyal. They begin being loyal to commanders. Pause 4 seconds. Civil war begins. Quietly. Pause 5 seconds. #52 0060 00 Part 1 ending. The empire still stands, but it is already sick. Pause 5 seconds. And in Part 2, the sickness spreads. Pause 7 seconds. Soft fade out. #Fire Part 2, the slow breaking. #Stopwatch total, minutes. #00 0001 00 Part 2 opening. Welcome back. Tonight, the cracks widen. Pause 4 seconds. #01 0012 00 The empire feels old. The empire still exists, but it feels tired. Pause 6 seconds. People stop imagining a future. Pause 5 seconds. #12 0025 00 Plague arrives. A ship enters port. A merchant coughs. A soldier collapses. Pause 4 seconds. The invisible spreads. Through streets, markets, and homes. Pause 6 seconds. #25 0035 00 Cities become traps. Cities depend on food. Cities depend on order. Pause 4 seconds. And now, they become cages. Pause 6 seconds. #35 0045 00 Government responds wrongly. Late empires tighten control. More taxes. More punishments. Pause 4 seconds. But fear cannot be punished away. Pause 6 seconds. #45 0055 civil war begins. Rumors grow. Generals rise. Provinces refuse. Pause 5 seconds. Armies move. Not outward, but inward. Pause 6 seconds. Hash 55, 0060 00, Part 2 ending. The people stop feeling like citizens and begin feeling like survivors. Pause 7 seconds. In Part 3, the last century begins. Pause 8 seconds. Hash tornado Part 3, the last century. Hash stopwatch total, minutes. Hash 00, 0002, 00, Part 3 opening. Welcome back. This is the last century. Pause 5 seconds. The empire still has a name, but no longer has a soul. Pause 6 seconds. Hash 02, 0014, 00, trade fades. Merchants travel less. Caravans disappear. Pause 4 seconds. Markets grow quiet. Pause 6 seconds. Hash 14, 00, 25, 00, people leave cities. Families move away. Into villages. Into hills. Pause 5 seconds. The great city becomes Hall. Pause 7 seconds. Hash 25, 00, 35, 00, the army becomes foreign. The empire hires outsiders. Mercenaries. Pause 4 seconds. Loyalty becomes something you buy. Pause 6 seconds. Hash 35, 0046, 00, strongmen rise. People stop trusting institutions. They trust local warlords. Pause 5 seconds. Protection replaces freedom. Pause 6 seconds. Hash 46, 0055, 00, knowledge fades. Schools close. Libraries rot. Pause 4 seconds. Not from hatred, but from instability. Pause 6 seconds. Hash 55, 0060, 00, Part 3 ending. The empire becomes a symbol. Pause 6 seconds. In Part 4, the last whisper arrives. Pause 8 seconds. Hash whole Part 4, the last whisper. Hash stopwatch total, minutes. Hash 00, 0002, 00, Part 4 opening. Welcome back. This is the final chapter. Pause 5 seconds. The empire does not explode. It fades. Pause 6 seconds. Hash 02, 0014, 00, routine without meaning. Officials stamp documents. Soldiers stand guard. Pause 4 seconds. But everything feels empty. Pause 7 seconds. Hash 14, 00, 25, 00, the last ruler. The last ruler is not legendary. He is tired. Entrapped. Pause 6 seconds. Hash 25, 0035, 00, currency breaks. Coins are forged. Coins are shaved. Pause 4 seconds. Trade collapses. Pause 6 seconds. Hash 35, 0046, 00, the army dissolves. Soldiers choose survival. Some become bandits. Some vanish. Pause 6 seconds. Hash 46, 0054, 00, final invasion. The invasion arrives. Not the biggest, just the final. Pause 7 seconds. The gates open. Pause 6 seconds. Hash 54, 0060, 00, the world shrinks plus ending. The world does not end. It becomes smaller. Pause 6 seconds. The empire becomes ruins. Broken roads. Dry fountains. Silent statues. Pause 8 seconds. And finally, the last whisper. Pause 10 seconds. Soft end. The empire is gone now. Not just weak. Not just broken. But gone. And yet, The world still exists. The sky still hangs above the land. The wind still moves through grass. The rivers still run. The seasons still turn. People still wake up in the morning. They still bake bread. They still carry water. They still repair roofs. They still whisper stories to children. History does not stop. It simply becomes smaller. Hourglass, not done the first year after collapse. In the first year, there is confusion. Not everywhere. Not all at once. But in many places. Some people don't even know the empire has fallen. They live too far away. They don't receive news. They don't read announcements. They don't see soldiers. In remote villages, life continues almost the same. But in cities, the change is immediate. The government offices close. The courts stop functioning. The tax collectors disappear. The old officials flee. Or hide. Or join whoever is now in power. And the people wait. They wait for the empire to return. They wait for a new emperor. They wait for a rescue. But no rescue comes. Derelict, the city becomes a memory. The city is still there. The buildings still stand. But the spirit is gone. The markets become quiet. The streets grow empty. The theaters close. The public baths dry up. The fountains stop running. The stones remain. But the life fades. And slowly, the city begins to shrink. Not because it is destroyed, but because it is abandoned. Families leave. Merchants leave. Craftsmen leave. They carry what they can. They take their children. They take tools. They take seeds. And they go to the countryside. Because the countryside has food. And food is the first law of the new world. Sheaf of rice, the countryside becomes the center. In the empire, the capital was the center. The palace was the center. The Senate was the center. But after collapse, the countryside becomes the center. The farm becomes the center. The village becomes the center. The local well becomes the center. Because after collapse, the most important thing is not politics. It is survival. And survival begins with water, grain, animals, shelter, firewood, safety. Shield protection becomes a currency. In the empire, money was power. After the empire, protection becomes power. A man with a sword becomes more valuable than a man with a title. A leader with soldiers becomes more important than a leader with paperwork. And people begin making new agreements, new loyalties, new relationships. They trade food. For protection, they trade labor. For safety, they trade loyalty. For survival. And slowly, a new system grows. Not planned, not designed, but formed, like mud hardening into shape. Small wars replace big wars. The empire used to fight large wars. Wars between empires. Wars with great armies. Wars with famous generals. But now, wars become smaller, more local, more personal. A village fights another village. A warlord fights a rival warlord. A small fort fights a small fort. The battles are not famous. The names are not remembered. But for the people living through them, they are just as deadly. Money fades away. Coins still exist, but fewer people trust them. A coin is only useful if someone believes it will still be useful tomorrow. After collapse, tomorrow is uncertain. So people return to barter. They trade grain, salt, cloth, animals, tools, wood, pottery, iron, oil, and the economy becomes slow, heavy, local. The long-distance trade routes that once connected the empire become quiet. The old forts become new homes. Along the old roads, there are still forts. Old border forts, old army camps, old watchtowers. They were built for a world of empire. Now, they become homes. Families move inside. They use the walls. They patch the roofs. They grow small gardens inside the courtyard. The fort becomes a village. The village becomes a town. The town becomes a small kingdom. And history continues. In a new shape. Hashbooks writing becomes rare. In the empire, writing was everywhere. Laws, taxes, letters, records, books. After collapse, writing becomes rare. Not because people hate reading, but because paper is expensive. Ink is expensive. Teachers are rare. Schools are rare. And survival is more urgent. Many children grow up without learning to read. And knowledge becomes something passed by voice, by memory, by story. The old world begins to fade from the minds of the living. Candle, the ruins become part of the landscape. Years pass, then decades. The empire's ruins remain. The aqueducts, the arenas, the temples, the palaces, the roads. But nature slowly reclaims them. Grass grows through cracks. Trees grow in courtyards. Vines climb stone walls. Birds nest in broken towers. And the ruins become normal. Children play in them. Goats wander through them. People take stones from them to build their own homes. The empire's greatness becomes a quarry. Fog, the old empire becomes a legend. After enough time, the empire becomes a legend. People still speak of it, but the stories change. They become exaggerated. They become magical. They become unclear. Some say the empire was built by giants. Some say the empire was guided by gods. Some say the empire fell because of curses. The truth becomes less important than the feeling. The empire becomes a symbol, a dream, a memory, a warning. Crescent moon, the new world is quiet. And now, the new world settles. It is not modern. It is not advanced. It is not wealthy. But it is alive. People form new kingdoms, new tribes, new alliances, new cultures, new languages, new traditions. And slowly, after generations, the world becomes stable again. Not the same as before, but stable. And one day, long after the empire has vanished, another empire will rise. Because history moves in circles. Rise, peak, decline, collapse, and then rise again. Soft ending. And so, the story continues. The empire ended with a whisper. But the world never stopped breathing. And as you rest, as you drift, as your thoughts grow quieter, you can let the echoes fade into sleep. The old empire is gone now. Its banners have faded. Its palaces are quiet. Its roads are cracked. Its coins are buried in the dirt. And yet, time keeps moving. Not fast, not loudly, but steadily. Because history has a habit of rebuilding, even after everything falls apart. And so, in the quiet world after collapse, something begins again. Not all at once, not everywhere, but slowly. The beginning of a new empire. Hourglass not done the first generations, living in the after. In the first generations after collapse, people do not think about empires. They think about weather, crops, water, wolves, bandits, sickness, winter. They don't care who ruled the world before. They care who is standing at the village gate today. The old empire is not a government anymore. It is a story, a memory, a ruin. And the people who live now are not citizens of anything large. They belong to their valley, their town, their river, their hill. And that is enough. The land becomes more important than gold. In the old empire, money mattered. Trade mattered. Taxes mattered. But now, land matters. Because land grows food. Land supports animals. Land provides wood. Land provides water. And if you own land, you have power. Not because you are rich, but because you can survive. So people begin to protect land. They mark borders. They argue. They fight. They inherit. They marry. They trade land. And slowly, a new system forms. Not written, not official, but real. The rise of the protector. In every broken world, someone becomes the protector. Sometimes it is a local warlord. Sometimes it is a respected elder. Sometimes it is a former soldier. Sometimes it is a clever farmer. But the protector has something others do not. Strength, weapons, followers, walls. And the protector makes a promise. A simple promise. I will keep you safe. In exchange, the people give food, labor, loyalty, silence, obedience. It is not called empire. Not yet. But it is the seed of empire. Because empire begins when protection becomes organized. Fort towns become small capitals. The old forts are still there. Some are broken. Some are abandoned. Some are half collapsed. But they are strong. Stone walls. High towers. Good positions. So people move into them. They repair them. They build houses inside. They store grain inside. They bring animals inside. And slowly, a fort becomes a town. Then, the town becomes a center. Villages nearby begin depending on it. Because the fort has guards, storage, weapons, walls, leadership. And now, the protector becomes more than a protector. He becomes a ruler. Cross small wars become bigger wars. At first, conflict is small. A fight over a river. A raid for cattle. A dispute over land. But as fort towns grow, the conflicts grow. Because now, rulers want more than survival. They want influence. They want control. They want tribute. And when one ruler becomes strong, neighbors become afraid. So they form alliances. Or they attack first. Or they surrender. Or they flee. And slowly, the map begins changing again. Not with ink, but with blood. The return of coins. For a long time, money was unreliable. Coins were useless. But eventually, as towns stabilize, people begin trading again. A merchant travels. A caravan returns. A boat arrives at a river port. And slowly, the old idea returns. Money. At first it is crude. Rough coins. Uneven metal. No standard weight. But people accept it. Because they want trade. They want tools. They want salt. They want cloth. They want oil. They want iron. And money returns. Like a small flame. Restarting in the dark. Railway roads begin to matter again. The old empire built roads. Stone roads. Long roads. Straight roads. After collapse, many roads became unsafe. Bandits controlled them. Forests swallowed them. Bridges fell. But now, a new ruler begins to understand something. Roads mean power. If you can control roads, you can control trade. If you control trade, you control wealth. If you control wealth, you can pay soldiers. If you can pay soldiers, you can expand. So the new rulers begin repairing roads. Not perfectly, not like before, but enough. They clear trees. They rebuild bridges. They place guards. They build small watchtowers. And travel becomes possible again. Slowly. Classical laws return, but different. The old empire had laws. Written laws. Complex laws. Courts. Judges. Appeals. Records. The new world begins with simpler rules. The ruler says, pay tribute. Obey orders. Do not steal. Do not rebel. Serve in war. Respect the fort. It is not fair. It is not gentle. But it creates stability. And people accept it. Because chaos is worse. Books the return of learning. This part happens slowly. Very slowly. At first, no one has time for learning. But after a few generations, stability grows. And in stable places, teachers appear again. A priest teaches letters. A traveler teaches numbers. A merchant teaches writing. A former official teaches old laws. And children begin learning again. Not many, but some. Then more. And eventually, books begin being copied. Not like before, but enough. And knowledge returns. Like spring grass. After a long winter. Crown a new king, claims a bigger title. And now, we reach the moment where the new world changes. A ruler becomes strong enough to think bigger. He controls many towns, many forts, many roads, many villages, many soldiers. And he begins calling himself something new. Not protector, not warlord, not chief. He calls himself king, emperor, high lord, ruler of the lands. The title does not matter, but the meaning does. Because the ruler is no longer protecting one town. He is controlling a region. Globe showing Europe, Africa, the new empire takes shape. The system becomes familiar again. Taxes return. Officials return. Soldiers become organized. Borders are drawn. Governors are appointed. And once again, the empire begins expanding. It conquers neighbors. It absorbs small kingdoms. It builds new forts. It demands tribute. The old pattern returns. Rise, growth, power, and the people living inside it begin believing the same old lie. This will last forever. Candle the quiet lesson. And now, as we end this final bonus chapter, we reach the quiet lesson of history. Empires fall, but people remain. Systems collapse, but life continues. Ruins appear, but new buildings rise. The world is always ending, and always beginning. And so, the new empire begins. Not because history is cruel, but because history is repetitive. Like waves. And as you drift, as you rest, as the night becomes still, you can let this final chapter fade. Softly, into sleep. The new empire has grown. The forts are towns. The towns are cities. The cities have walls. The rulers have armies. The roads are traveled. The markets are alive. It is strong. It is organized. It is proud. But all strength is temporary. Hourglass not done the slow growth. At first, the new empire is small. A single ruler, a handful of towns, a few thousand people. Over decades, generations, it grows. More towns submit. More villages pay tribute. More roads are repaired. More soldiers are trained. People begin to believe this empire might last. And that belief is powerful. It allows planning. It allows culture. It allows trade. It allows monuments to be built. Classical institutions form again. The new empire needs rules. Officials are appointed. Courts are established. Taxes are collected. Soldiers follow orders. Schools begin to teach children. The pattern repeats. Like the empire before. Like the empire before that. Power becomes centralized. The ruler's word is law. The army enforces it. The roads connect towns. And life stabilizes. Quietly, slowly, steadily. Sheaf of rice prosperity returns, slowly. Trade returns. Merchants travel. Caravans move. Coins are minted. Farms prosper. Markets hum. People eat better. Villages grow. Birth rates rise. Old ruins are rebuilt. For a moment, the world feels safe. Like it did before. Like it always seems. Before the fall. Crossed warnings of hubris. Yet, history whispers its warning. All growth brings new risk. Borders expand. Armies march farther. Taxes grow heavier. Officials grow greedy. And the people, the same humans, grow restless. Rumors spread. Corruption spreads. Discontent grows quietly. The cycle begins again. Castle, the first cracks appear. At first, barely noticeable. A tax collector is late. A caravan is raided. A harvest fails. A governor rebels. Then another. Then another. The cracks form slowly, like hairline fractures in stone. And the empire still seems strong. It looks unshakable. It is proud. It is confident. But inside, the weakness grows. Fog, the cycle repeats. Every empire follows this rhythm. Rise. Peak. Decline. Collapse. And after collapse, someone always rises again. A protector. A warlord. A king. An emperor. They rebuild. They repair. They conquer. They organize. And the people, the same humans, adapt, survive, live. Hash candle quiet reflection. The new empire feels eternal. But we know it is not. History moves in circles. Civilizations rise. Civilizations fall. Life continues. And people endure. Ruins become foundations. Loss becomes learning. Whispers of old empires guide the builders of new empires. And quietly, softly, the cycle continues. Hash crescent moon closing the series. So tonight, as you drift, remember, empires are temporary. People endure. Life continues. History whispers, and the world moves. Softly, slowly, calmly. The new empire peaks. And someday, its last whisper will come. And the cycle will begin again. Good night.